Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I found a deep web hitman who lives on the Antarctica. The next day, he knocked on my door. I've always been a curious person, the kind of curiosity that makes you dig a little too deep into things you probably shouldn't. It started out innocent, really. Late night rabbit holes on YouTube about unsolved mysteries, strange disappearances, that kind of stuff. But, as many of you might know, once you get a taste of the weird and the unknown, it's hard to stop. I had heard about the deep web countless times. It was the shadowy underbelly of the internet, a place where people could get anything from illegal substances to counterfeit money. But what always fascinated me the most were the stories about hitmen. I mean, who in their right mind would hire someone to take out another human being? It seemed like something out of a movie, not real life. So after months of curiosity gnawing at me, I decided to check it out. I'm not an idiot. I knew how dangerous this was. I made sure to set up a VPN, use a secure browser, and stay as anonymous as possible. I wasn't planning on doing anything illegal, just looking. Navigating the deep web is like wandering through a pitch-black maze. You don't know what's around the corner, and half the time you're scared of bumping into something or someone you shouldn't. I stumbled across forums where people exchanged all kinds of shady information, but none of it felt real. It was like these people were just trying to mess with anyone who wanted in. But then, one night, I found it. The place I'd only heard about in whispers, a marketplace dedicated to hitmen. The layout was surprisingly simple, almost like Craigslist, but darker. There were listings with vague descriptions, prices, and even customer reviews, which felt so surreal that I nearly laughed out loud. It was like Yelp for killers. I clicked through a few profiles, all the while feeling my heart pounding in my chest. Most of them seemed like scams, poorly written bios, pixelated images, and absurdly high prices. But there was one that caught my eye. The profile picture was just a black square, and the name was equally unremarkable: Silent Winter. The description was brief, almost clinical, discreet, reliable, no questions asked. Location: Antarctica. Antarctica. It seemed like a joke, but the reviews, they were unnervingly detailed and almost reverent. People wrote about how Silent Winter had completed jobs that no one else would touch, in ways that left no trace. A few even mentioned that they never actually met him, but that he had somehow known where they lived. One review stood out among the rest: if you contact him, be prepared for a visit. He finds you. The rational part of me was screaming to close the page, to shut down my computer and forget I'd ever seen this. But another part, the part that had pushed me this far, was tempted. Just a little message, I told myself, just to see if it was real. So I did it. I typed out a short, simple message. Is this for real? I hesitated for a moment, then hit send. I didn't expect a response, at least not immediately. But within seconds, a new message popped up. My breath caught in my throat as I clicked it open. The message was short, only 3 words. Yes. Address. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This had to be a scam, right? There was no way this was real. But before I could think any further, my fingers were already typing out my address. I was almost on autopilot, driven by some bizarre combination of curiosity and disbelief. After sending my address, I stared at the screen, half expecting some sort of follow-up message, maybe a demand for money or something, but nothing came. The chat window just sat there, blank and foreboding. The longer I looked at it, the more my unease grew. I suddenly felt like I had crossed a line I never should have even approached. After a few minutes of staring at the screen, the reality of what I'd done hit me like a ton of bricks. What the hell was I thinking? I'd just sent my home address to a stranger on the deep web, a stranger claiming to be a hitman living in freaking Antarctica, of all places. Panic started to set in. I immediately shut down my computer, unplugged it, and paced around my room, my mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, each more terrifying than the last. I tried to tell myself it was all just a joke, some elaborate scam to mess with people like me. But deep down, a gnawing feeling of dread was settling in. What if it wasn't? What if I'd just invited someone into my life that I couldn't take back? I barely slept that night, and when I did, my dreams were filled with shadows and icy landscapes. But the worst part was the overwhelming sense that I was being watched, that someone or something was out there, waiting. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a bad decision, fueled by late-night boredom. I went about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside, sent my heart racing. And then, around midday, there was a knock at the door. It was a heavy, deliberate knock, the kind that sent shivers down your spine. I froze in place, my mind screaming at me not to answer, but my body moved on its own, like I was in a trance. I walked to the door and slowly, almost hesitantly, opened it. There was no one there, just an empty porch and the faint sound of wind in the distance. But before I could even begin to process what was happening, I noticed something lying on the ground just outside my door. It was a small, unmarked envelope, and as I bent down to pick it up, my hands trembling, I realized that whatever I had started, it was far from over. I stood there on my doorstep, the envelope clutched in my hand, my pulse racing like it was trying to escape my body. The air around me felt colder, sharper, as if the world itself had shifted in some imperceptible way. I wanted to believe this was all some elaborate prank, maybe one of my friends messing with me, but deep down, I knew none of them could have pulled this off. They didn't even know about my late-night deep web explorations. The envelope was plain, almost too plain. No markings, no stamp, no return address, just a sealed flap that begged to be opened, but screamed at me to leave it alone. I turned it over in my hands a few times, trying to delay the inevitable. My gut twisted with fear and anticipation, but there was no going back. I had to know what was inside. With shaky fingers, I carefully peeled the envelope open. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words typed in perfect, emotionless black font. I am watching. Welcome to the cold. No signature, no explanation, just those chilling words. The simplicity of the message was what terrified me the most. It was like the person behind it didn't need to threaten or intimidate. They were just stating a fact, something they knew I would understand without further elaboration. Welcome to the cold. It didn't take much imagination to connect that with the supposed location of the hitman, Antarctica, but the idea of someone actually being out there in that desolate, frozen wasteland and somehow connected to me was insane. And yet, here I was, holding undeniable proof that this wasn't just a bad dream. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Had I just been marked, Was this some kind of twisted game? I couldn't wrap my head around the idea that someone had found me so quickly, especially someone who claimed to live in the most isolated place on Earth. It didn't make any sense, but at the same time, it was happening. I was officially out of my depth. The smart thing to do would have been to call the police, but what could I tell them? That I'd contacted a hitman on the deep web, and now someone was stalking me. They'd probably arrest me on the spot for even messing around in those dark corners of the internet. Besides, something about this felt beyond the reach of normal authorities, like I had stepped into a realm where their power didn't extend. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, jumping at every sound and glancing nervously out the windows. The sky outside seemed to darken quicker than usual, and by evening, I had every light in the house on, as if that could somehow protect me from whatever was lurking out there. The hours dragged by, and with each passing minute, the silence grew heavier, more oppressive. I couldn't sit still, pacing back and forth, my thoughts spiraling. What if this was just the beginning? What if the next time it wasn't just a message? I kept replaying the knock at the door in my mind, wondering if it had been a warning or a promise. Around midnight, just when I thought I might finally lose my mind from the tension, my phone buzzed. The sudden noise nearly made me jump out of my skin. I grabbed it off the table, my hands trembling as I looked at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Check your front porch." My heart dropped into my stomach. I stood there frozen, unable to move. The message was so simple, so direct, but it carried a weight that made my entire body feel like it was sinking into the floor. This was real. Someone was out there, watching me, and they wanted me to know it. I didn't want to go outside. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to lock the doors, turn off the lights, and hide. But I knew I couldn't avoid this forever. If I didn't confront whatever was happening, it would only get worse. So with a deep breath and my heart hammering in my chest, I forced myself to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for what felt like an eternity before I finally twisted it and pulled the door open. The porch light flickered as I stepped outside, casting long, wavering shadows across the empty street. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for that time of year, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stepped out into the night. At first, I didn't see anything. The porch was empty, just like it had been that morning. But then I noticed something off to the side, tucked just out of view. It was a small package, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a thin piece of twine. My heart pounded louder in my ears as I slowly approached it. The package was light, almost unnervingly so, as if it didn't contain anything substantial. I carried it inside, closing the door behind me, and placed it on the kitchen table. For a moment, I just stared at it, trying to decide whether I should open it or burn it. In the end, curiosity won out, just like it always did. I carefully untied the twine and unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was a small black box. It was plain, without any markings, just like the envelope had been. I lifted the lid, half expecting something horrific inside, but what I found was almost worse in its simplicity. A phone. One of those old flip-style phones that no one used anymore. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, confused and terrified. Why had they sent me this? What was I supposed to do with it? As if in response to my thoughts, the phone suddenly vibrated in my hand. The screen lit up with a message. "Turn off your lights." Every muscle in my body tensed. a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I stared at the message, feeling the walls close in around me. It wasn't a request, it was a command. I had no choice. They were watching me, and I didn't know how far they'd go if I didn't comply. With shaking hands, I went around the house, turning off each light one by one until I was standing in complete darkness. The only light came from the dim glow of the phone screen. As soon as the last light was out, another message appeared. "Come outside." I stood there, the phone trembling in my hand, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. This was insane. I didn't know who was out there or what they wanted from me, but I couldn't ignore them. Not now. They had pulled me into their world, and there was no way out. Taking a deep breath, I stilled myself and walked back to the front door. The night air was even colder now, biting through my clothes as I stepped outside. The street was silent, unnaturally so, as if the world was holding its breath. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone, just the same empty street and flickering porch light. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that I had done what they asked, and now they'd leave me alone. But then, the phone vibrated in my hand again. I glanced down at the screen. "Look to your left." I slowly turned my head, the fear almost paralyzing me, and that's when I saw it. Standing just at the edge of the shadows, where the light from my porch couldn't reach, was a figure. Tall, dressed in something dark that blended into the night. I couldn't make out any features, just the silhouette. But what I could see, what made my blood run cold, was the glint of something metal in their hand. They were holding a knife. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching me. I was frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. It was like I was caught in some horrible nightmare, unable to wake up. Finally, the phone buzzed again, snapping me out of my trance. I looked down at the screen, my heart pounding in my throat. "Good night." As soon as I read the words, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as if they had never been there at all. I stood there shaking for what felt like hours, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Eventually, I forced myself to move, stumbling back into the house and locking the door behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, the phone still clutched in my hand, my mind reeling. Whoever they were, they had made it clear that they could reach me, that they were in control, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. As I sat there in the darkness, I realized that my life had just changed forever. I had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The cold had found me, and it wasn't going to let go. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing at the edge of the darkness, holding that knife, watching me. I kept telling myself that it had to be a dream, some sort of twisted nightmare born out of my own stupid curiosity. But the cold, hard feel of the phone in my hand reminded me that it was all too real. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, I felt no relief. The sunlight did nothing to chase away the lingering sense of dread that hung over me like a dark cloud. I hadn't turned the lights back on, too afraid that any sudden movement or change might trigger another message, another appearance. I needed to get out of the house, to clear my head, but the thought of going outside made my skin crawl. What if they were still out there, watching, waiting for me to make a move? But I couldn't stay cooped up forever, paralyzed by fear. I had to take control, to do something, anything, that would break me out of this nightmare. I grabbed my keys, shoved the phone into my pocket, and practically ran out to my car. The morning air was crisp, almost refreshing, but it did little to calm my nerves. I locked the car doors the moment I got inside, the engine roaring to life as I sped out of the driveway. I drove around aimlessly for a while, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me. But the streets were empty, almost eerily so. It was like the whole world had gone quiet, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot of a small rundown diner on the outskirts of town. It was a place I rarely visited, but it felt safe, familiar in a way that my own home no longer did. I parked as close to the entrance as I could and hurried inside. The smell of coffee and greasy food hit me as soon as I walked through the door. There were a few other customers scattered around, mostly older folks who looked like regulars. They barely glanced at me as I slipped into a booth at the back, my heart still pounding in my chest. A waitress appeared at my table, her face worn and tired, but kind. I ordered a coffee, my voice shaky, and tried to steady my breathing as she walked away. The reality of what I was dealing with was starting to sink in, and I felt like I was on the verge of breaking down. When she returned with my coffee, I stared into the dark liquid, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just keep running, but going back home felt like walking into a trap. The police wouldn't believe me, and even if they did, how could they protect me from something or someone that seemed to be everywhere? As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, I felt the phone buzz in my pocket. The sudden vibration nearly made me spill my coffee. I pulled it out with trembling hands, dread tightening in my chest as I unlocked the screen. Another message from the same unknown number. Why did you leave? My blood ran cold. They knew I had left the house. They were watching me, even now. My eyes darted around the diner, scanning the faces of the other customers. None of them seemed out of place, but that didn't mean anything. Whoever was behind this could be anyone, anywhere. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to throw the phone out the window and drive as far away as possible, but I knew that wouldn't stop them. They had found me once, and they would find me again. The thought was suffocating. Another buzz, another message. Come home. 2 words, simple and direct, but filled with a weight that made my heart sink. There was no threat, no ultimatum, but the command was clear. They wanted me back at the house, and I had no idea why, but the fear of what might happen if I didn't comply was overwhelming. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to set the phone down on the table to keep from dropping it. I couldn't keep running. I had to face this, whatever it was. Maybe if I did what they asked, they'd let me go. Maybe it would all end. I paid for the coffee I hadn't touched and left the diner, my legs feeling like lead as I walked back to the car. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with all the horrible possibilities of what awaited me. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked different somehow. Darker, more menacing. The curtains were drawn tight, and there was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I forced myself out of the car and up the steps, my every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had come this far. There was no turning back now. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the inside of the house cold and dark. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me from all sides. Then the phone buzzed again. Go to the basement. I hadn't been down to the basement in months. It was a place I avoided, mostly because it was cold, damp, and filled with all the junk I had accumulated over the years. But now, it was the last place I wanted to go. But I had no choice. They were in control, and I was just a pawn in whatever twisted game they were playing. I found myself moving toward the basement door, my body on autopilot, my mind numb with fear. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. When I reached the bottom, I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the small basement windows. The basement was just as I remembered it, cluttered, musty, with boxes stacked against the walls and old furniture covered in dust. But something was different. There, in the center of the room, was a single, old-fashioned television set. It was one of those bulky, boxy models from decades ago, the kind no one used anymore. And it was on, the screen flickering with static. I didn't own a TV like that. I had no idea how it had gotten there, but it was impossible to ignore. Static crackled, filling the room with a low hum that made my skin crawl. Then without warning, the static cleared, and the screen showed a live feed. It was the front of my house, the view from the porch looking out into the street. The camera must have been hidden somewhere, but there was no mistaking it. This was my house. I watched, horrified, as the feed shifted, the camera panning slowly until it focused on the front door. The door I had just walked through moments ago. And then, the door on the screen opened. The figure from the night before stepped into the view. The same dark clothing, the same cold, calculated movements. But this time, there was no knife in their hand. Instead, they were holding something else, something small and white, an envelope. My heart stopped as I realized what I was seeing. They had just been outside. They had placed something on my porch again, and they wanted me to know it. The screen flickered, the image dissolving back into static. The TV buzzed loudly, filling the basement with an ominous hum that vibrated through my bones. And then, the phone in my hand buzzed again. Open the envelope. My legs felt like they were made of lead as I slowly climbed the stairs back to the main floor. My mind was racing, but my thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in this house. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see what they had left for me, but I knew I had no choice. The door creaked as I pulled it open, the cold air biting at my skin. The envelope was there, just as I had seen on the screen, lying on the welcome mat like a ghostly message from some otherworldly being. I bent down, picked it up, and retreated back into the house, my hands trembling as I closed the door. I didn't wait this time. I tore the envelope open, desperate to know what new horror awaited me. Inside was a single sheet of paper, just like the last time. But this time, the message was different. The words were printed in the same emotionless font, but they were more chilling than anything I had read before. Tonight we meet. I stared at the paper in my hands. The words, "Tonight we meet," burned into my brain like a brand. It was the kind of message that carried a finality, a sense of inevitability that left no room for hope. My entire body was trembling, the weight of the situation pressing down on me like a vice. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, the endgame was coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The house felt different now, colder, like the walls were closing in on me. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like a footstep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere in the darkness they were already here, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I tried to think of something, anything I could do to regain control, but every option felt useless. The police, they'd never believe me, and even if they did, how could they protect me from something or someone this relentless? Leaving town, that seemed pointless. They had found me once, and they'd find me again. No matter where I went, there was only one option left: to face whatever was coming head on. The thought made my stomach turn, but I knew that there was no escaping this. They had drawn me into their game, and now I had to play my part. The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I tried to busy myself, to keep my mind from spiraling into complete panic, but nothing worked. The ticking of the clock on the wall became a constant reminder that time was running out. As the day slowly bled into evening, I found myself back in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkening sky. The sun was setting, casting long orange streaks across the horizon. It would be night soon, and that's when it would happen, whatever it was. I needed to be prepared, or at least as prepared as I could be. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. I even grabbed a kitchen knife, though I knew deep down that it wouldn't do much good if they decided to come inside. But it gave me some small comfort, like a talisman against the inevitable. Finally, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared, plunging the world into darkness, the phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound made me jump, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I pulled it out and looked at the screen. A new message. "Turn off the lights. We're here." My breath caught in my throat. They were already here, somewhere close. I could feel it in the air, a cold, oppressive presence that seeped into my bones. I didn't want to obey, didn't want to plunge myself into the darkness, but I knew I had no choice. One by one, I turned off the lights, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The darkness swallowed the house, the only light coming from the dim glow of the screen. The shadows seemed to pulse and shift, alive with some unseen energy. Then there was a knock at the door. It was slow, deliberate, each knock echoing through the silent house like a death toll. I stood frozen in place, my mind screaming at me not to answer, but I knew that ignoring it wouldn't help. They were here, and they wouldn't leave until I faced them. With the knife gripped tightly in one hand and the phone in the other, I made my way to the front door. The knocking continued, steady and patient, as if they knew I was coming but didn't mind waiting. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my heart hammering in my chest. The handle felt ice cold under my fingers as I slowly turned it, pulling the door open just a crack. The cold night air rushed in, and for a moment I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. 3 figures stood on my porch, their forms barely visible in the dim light. They were dressed in dark, heavy coats, their faces obscured by hoods that cast deep shadows. But even from this distance, I could feel their eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. They didn't speak, didn't move. They just stood there, silent and foreboding, waiting for me to do something. My mouth was dry, my voice stuck in my throat. I wanted to ask who they were, what they wanted, but the words wouldn't come. And then, as if sensing my hesitation, one of them stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. They reached into their coat, and for a terrifying moment, I thought they were going to pull out a weapon, but instead, they withdrew another envelope, identical to the ones I had received before. They held it out to me, the paper pale against the darkness. I stared at it, my mind racing, but I knew I had no choice. With a shaking hand, I reached out and took the envelope, the paper cold against my skin. As soon as I had it in my hand, the figure stepped back, rejoining the others. They didn't say a word, didn't make any threatening moves. They just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to slam the door, to lock them out and pretend this wasn't happening. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. They were in control now, and all I could do was follow along. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was another sheet of paper, but this time the message was different. It wasn't a threat or a command. It was an address, a place not far from where I lived, a small abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, and below the address, a single line of text. Come alone. Midnight. My heart sank as I read the words. They were drawing me into the final act of this twisted game, a game I had no hope of winning, but there was no other option. If I didn't go, I knew they would come for me, and I wasn't sure I'd survive that. The figures on the porch watched me for a moment longer, as if waiting to see my reaction. Then without a word, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like ghosts. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the cold wind biting at my skin, the weight of the envelope in my hand, a constant reminder of what I had to do. When I finally closed the door, the house felt even colder, emptier. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me from all sides. Midnight was only a few hours away, but it felt like I was counting down the minutes to my own execution. I knew I had to go. There was no way out of this, no way to escape. Whatever awaited me at that warehouse, it was the end of the line. I could feel it in my bones, but I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I grabbed my coat and slipped the knife into my pocket, the cold steel reassuring against my thigh. I didn't know what good it would do, but it was better than nothing. I couldn't let them think I was completely helpless. As I stepped out into the night, the darkness seemed to swallow me whole. The streets were empty, the houses dark, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. The drive to the warehouse was a blur, my mind racing with all the horrible possibilities of what might happen when I got there. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, the minutes ticking by far too quickly. Midnight was approaching, and with it, the unknown. When I finally reached the address, my heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. The warehouse was exactly what I expected. Old, run down, with broken windows and rusted metal walls. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, a forgotten relic of a time long past. I parked the car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. This was it, the end of the line. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and stepped out of the car. The night was eerily quiet, the air thick with tension. I walked towards the warehouse, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness. The front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had been expecting me. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence, and stepped inside. The darkness inside was almost suffocating, the air heavy with the smell of dust and decay. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, but I knew they were there. I could feel their presence, like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then, From the shadows, I heard it, a low, cold voice that sent a chill down my spine. "Welcome," the voice echoed through the darkened warehouse, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to see who had spoken, but the darkness was too thick, too complete. I could sense movement in the shadows, subtle shifts that hinted at figures just out of sight, watching me with eyes I couldn't see. I gripped the knife in my pocket, the cold metal digging into my palm, a small anchor in the overwhelming sea of fear. The voice had welcomed me, but it felt more like a warning, a reminder that I had stepped into their world now, and there was no turning back. "Who are you?" My voice sounded weak, barely above a whisper, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the warehouse. I wasn't sure if I wanted an answer, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than any reply. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. Then slowly, the darkness seemed to shift, and the dim outlines of the three figures emerged from the shadows. They were standing in a loose circle, their faces still obscured by the hoods of their coats. The only light came from a small, flickering lantern one of them held, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. They didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from this place as possible. But I knew it was pointless. They had drawn me here, and there was no escape. The thought sent a wave of panic crashing over me, but I forced it down, gripping the knife tighter. Finally, the figure with the lantern stepped forward, the light illuminating their face just enough for me to see the edge of a cold, thin smile. The voice that spoke next was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. "You wanted to know if it was real," they said, their tone calm, almost casual. "Now you know." My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing about this was logical. Nothing about this was right. I wanted to ask them what they wanted, why they had chosen me, but the words caught in my throat. I felt like a rabbit caught in a snare, helpless and doomed. The figure moved closer, and I could see their eyes now, dark and cold, like the depths of some frozen abyss. They reached into their coat and pulled out something small, something I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. My heart pounded in my chest as I took another step back, but I was already pressed against the wall, trapped. They held out the object to me, and as the light from the lantern flickered over it, I saw what it was, a simple black business card. My confusion deepened as I stared at it, not understanding what this meant, why they were giving it to me. The figure's smile widened, a chilling expression that made my blood run cold. "You've been chosen," they said, their voice barely more than a whisper, "to join us." I shook my head, my mind rebelling against the words. "Chosen for what?" I managed to choke out, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "To be one of us," the figure replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You sought us out. Now we offer you a place among us, in the cold, where no one can reach you." The words hung in the air, heavy with a meaning I couldn't fully grasp. They were offering me something, but what exactly? To become like them, to disappear into the shadows, to live in the cold, isolated from the world. It didn't make sense. None of this did, but as I stared into the figure's eyes, I realized, with a sinking dread, that they were deadly serious. This wasn't just some twisted game. They were offering me a choice, and I knew that refusing it would come with consequences. "What happens if I say no?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. The figure's smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression that was almost pitying. "You've already stepped into the cold," they said quietly. "There is no going back. If you refuse, you will be left behind, alone, and the cold will find you, whether you want it to or not." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew they were telling the truth. I had crossed a line, one that couldn't be uncrossed. I had wanted to see if it was real, and now I was faced with the reality of it. A choice between joining them in the shadows or being hunted by something far worse. The silence stretched on, suffocating in its intensity. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, waiting for my decision. The knife in my pocket felt small and useless, a flimsy defense against the darkness that surrounded me. With a sinking heart, I realized that I had no real choice. I could feel the cold creeping in, not just around me, but inside me, seeping into my bones, into my very soul. It was an invitation, a pull that I couldn't resist, no matter how much I wanted to. Slowly, with trembling fingers, I reached out and took the business card from the figure's hand. The black surface was smooth and cold to the touch. The only thing on it, a single chilling word: Silent Winter. The figure nodded, a small, satisfied smile tugging at the corners of their mouth. "Welcome to the cold," they said softly, and the words felt like a death sentence. The other two figures moved closer, forming a tight circle around me. The light from the lantern flickered and dimmed, the shadows closing in until I was surrounded by darkness. I could feel their presence, cold and overwhelming, pressing in on me from all sides. For a moment, I thought I might pass out, the fear and the cold too much to bear. But then, slowly, the darkness began to recede, the shadows pulling back as the light from the lantern grew stronger. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the warehouse. I was standing in the middle of a vast, frozen landscape, the ground beneath my feet covered in a thick layer of ice. The sky above was dark, filled with swirling clouds that blocked out the stars. The cold was biting, more intense than anything I had ever felt before, but it didn't hurt. It was almost comforting, like a blanket wrapping around me. The figures were still with me, their forms now more distinct, less shadowy. They were no longer faceless. I could see their features now, sharp and pale, their eyes cold and distant. They were like ghosts, beings of ice and shadow, and I was one of them. I understood then what they had meant by the cold finding me. I had become part of it, part of something bigger, something beyond the world I had known. There was no going back, no returning to the life I had before. I was lost to the cold, a ghost in the shadows, just like them. As I stood there, the cold seeping into every part of me, I felt a strange sense of peace. The fear was gone, replaced by a calm acceptance. This was my life now, my reality. The world of the living was a distant memory, fading into the void. The cold had claimed me, and I welcomed it. I talked to real alien on the deep web. Let me start by saying I'm not the type of person who usually dabbles in the dark corners of the internet. I've heard all the stories, read the warnings, and for the most part, I've stayed in my lane. But curiosity is a hell of a thing, and one late night, it got the better of me. It was a Thursday, just past midnight. I had been scrolling through Reddit, looking for something to distract me from the monotony of life. My feed was full of the usual, a mix of memes, news, and conspiracy theories. One post caught my eye though, buried deep in a thread about the unknown and the unexplained. It was a comment from a user with a strange username, something like void_wanderer. The comment simply read, "There's a place on the deep web where you can talk to them. If you're serious, DM me." Now, I'm not the kind of person who believes in UFOs or little green men, but there was something about that comment that piqued my interest. Maybe it was the mystery of it all, or maybe I was just bored out of my mind. Whatever the reason, I clicked on the user's profile and sent them a message. "Hey, I saw your comment on Reddit. What do you mean by talk to them?" I half expected the message to go unanswered or to be met with some kind of troll response. To my surprise, void_wanderer replied almost immediately. "It's not for everyone. If you're serious, I'll send you a link. But be warned, once you go down this path, there's no turning back." That should have been my first red flag, but instead of closing the chat and moving on with my life, I found myself typing a response. "I'm in." A few seconds later, a link appeared in my inbox. It wasn't your typical URL. It was a .onion address, which meant it could only be accessed through the Tor browser, a gateway to the deep web. The message was clear. Void_wanderer wasn't joking around. I stared at the link for a few minutes, my finger hovering over the mouse. Every instinct in my body was telling me to walk away, to forget I'd ever seen that comment. But the thought of talking to an alien, or whatever void_wanderer was hinting at, was too intriguing to pass up. I downloaded the Tor browser and typed in the link, my heart pounding in my chest as the page began to load. The screen went black for a moment, and then a simple, almost archaic-looking website appeared. The background was pitch black, with green text that seemed to pulse slightly, like an old computer terminal from the 80s. The title of the page was The Interface. There was no explanation, no instructions, just a single text box at the center of the screen with a blinking cursor. I hesitated, my fingers trembling slightly as I placed them on the keyboard. What was I supposed to type? Who or what was I even supposed to be talking to? I tried the most obvious thing first. Hello? For a few moments, nothing happened. I was about to close the browser, feeling foolish for even entertaining this idea, when the text on the screen began to change. Slowly, almost deliberately, new words appeared, one letter at a time. "Greetings, human." I froze. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Who was on the other end of this conversation? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was there really someone, something, waiting for me? I shook off the nerves and typed another message. "Who are you?" The response was quicker this time. "I am an observer, a traveler from a place you cannot comprehend. I am here to learn about your kind, to understand your world. You may call me Emmett." I stared at the screen, my heart now hammering in my chest. This had to be a joke, right? But something about the way the words appeared, the deliberate pace, felt off. It didn't feel like I was talking to another person, at least not one that was human. "How do I know this isn't some kind of prank?" I typed, hoping to catch whoever was behind this in a lie. The response was instant, almost as if Emmett had anticipated my question. "You sought me out. You are curious about what lies beyond your understanding. Now you have found it. This is not a prank. This is the beginning of something much larger than you can imagine." There was a finality to the message that sent a shiver down my spine. I was too deep now, too far in to back out. My curiosity had gotten the better of me, and there was no way I was going to stop now. "What do you want from me?" I asked, half expecting the conversation to take a sinister turn. The response was almost comforting in its simplicity. "I want to learn. I want to understand your world, your emotions, your experiences. In return, I will share knowledge that is beyond your reach. Are you willing to proceed?" It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into the abyss. I knew that once I took the next step, there would be no going back, but the promise of knowledge, of understanding something greater than myself, was too tempting. "Yes, I'm willing." The screen flickered, and then a new message appeared. "Then let us begin." As I stared at the glowing text, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just opened a door that should have stayed closed, but it was too late now. The conversation had started, and there was no turning back. The days after that first encounter were a blur. I found myself thinking about Emmett constantly, replaying our conversation over and over in my head. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, an obsession that I couldn't shake. I tried to distract myself, to focus on work, friends, anything else, but the thought of that dark screen with its green pulsing text haunted me. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know more. So I opened Tor, typed in the link, and waited. The page loaded as before, the same black background, the same text box. My hands were sweaty as I typed the first words. "I'm back." There was a pause before the reply came. This time, it felt longer than before, as if Emmett was considering my presence, weighing my intentions. "Welcome back, human. Have you come to learn?" "Yes," I typed quickly, my curiosity burning brighter than my fear. "Then let us continue." The words appeared on the screen in that slow, deliberate manner, like each letter was carefully chosen. For the next few minutes, Emmett asked me questions, seemingly simple ones at first. They were about my life, my experiences, my thoughts. I tried to give vague answers, still unsure if this was some elaborate prank. But the more I engaged, the more the questions became specific. "What do you fear the most?" That question caught me off guard. My heart skipped a beat, and I hesitated before typing. I could feel the weight of the question pressing down on me, like Emmett knew more about me than I wanted to admit. "Failure," I typed, trying to play it safe. It was true after all. The fear of letting people down, of not living up to expectations, had always been a shadow over my life. The screen flickered, and then new text appeared, sending a chill down my spine. "That is not your greatest fear. Do not lie to me." I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. How could it know that? My mind raced through possible explanations, but none of them made sense. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and decided to be honest this time. "I'm afraid of being alone, of losing the people I care about." The response was instant. "Good. Honesty will serve you well here. I understand your fear. It is a common one among your kind. But know this, true isolation, the kind that stretches beyond your comprehension, is something far worse than you can imagine." A wave of unease washed over me. There was something ominous in Emmett's words, something that hinted at experiences far beyond anything I could comprehend. Before I could process it, Emmett continued, "Tell me, what do you think happens when you die?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of how to answer. It was a question I had pondered before, like most people, but I never expected to discuss it with whatever Emmett was. Still, I typed out my thoughts. I don't know. Maybe we just stop existing. Or maybe there's something more, like an afterlife. The screen remained still for a few moments, then responded. Your species is unique in its uncertainty, in its obsession with the unknown. Where I come from, death is not feared, nor is it embraced. It simply is, a transition from one state to another. But for you, death is a mystery, a source of endless fear and speculation. Would you like to know what truly happens? My blood ran cold. There was a part of me that didn't want to know, that was terrified of the answer. But my curiosity, the same curiosity that had led me to this dark corner of the internet in the first place, won out. Yes, the next words appeared slowly, almost as if Emmett was choosing them with great care. When you die, your consciousness does not simply end. It is absorbed, if you will, collected by entities far beyond your understanding. Some call them gods. Others think of them as demons. They exist in the spaces between realities, feeding on the energies of the dead. Your soul, as you might call it, is a valuable resource to them, a currency in a world you cannot see. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was getting too weird, too unsettling, but I couldn't stop reading, even if I wanted to. So, what happens to us after that? Are we just gone? Not gone, Emma responded. Repurposed, reformed. You may continue to exist in another form, another state, but you will no longer be you. As you understand yourself now, you will become part of something larger, something incomprehensible to your current mind. A deep sense of dread settled in my gut. This wasn't just a creepy story or a strange conversation. There was something profoundly disturbing about what Emmett was saying. Something that felt too real, too possible. Why are you telling me this? I typed, my hands shaking. Because you asked to learn, Emmett replied. And because knowledge is the only thing that can truly set you free from the fear that binds you. You sought the unknown, and now you are beginning to understand it. But beware, human, this path is not without its dangers. The more you know, the more you see. And once you see, you cannot unsee. I wanted to log off, to close the browser and never think about this again. But before I could even move, Emmett's final message appeared on the screen. The next time you return, I will show you what lies beyond. If you are brave enough to face it. The screen flickered once more, and then went dark. The website was gone, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the black monitor. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. What had I just done? What had I started? I shut down my computer, but the words lingered in my mind, echoing through the silence of my room. The next time you return, if you are brave enough. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I had a choice to make, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what might come next. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glowing green text of Emmett's words burned into the back of my eyelids. I couldn't concentrate at work. I barely slept, and when I did, I was plagued by nightmares, visions of being lost in endless black voids, with only the distant echo of Emmett's voice guiding me deeper into the darkness. I tried to distract myself, to avoid thinking about the next step, but it was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I knew I should just walk away, forget everything that had happened, but the promise of knowledge, of understanding what lies beyond, was like a hook buried deep in my mind, pulling me back. On the fourth night, after my last conversation with Emmett, I finally caved. The silence in my apartment felt suffocating. The ticking of the clock on the wall amplified in the empty space. With a deep breath, I opened the Tor browser once again, typed in the familiar link, and waited. This time, the page loaded slower than before, as if something was hesitating on the other side. When the screen finally lit up, the text box was there, waiting for me. The black background felt even darker, more oppressive, and the green text seemed to pulse with a life of its own. "I'm here," I typed, my heart hammering in my chest. The response was almost immediate, as if Emmett had been expecting me. "Welcome back, human. Are you ready to see what lies beyond?" I hesitated. This was the moment I had been dreading, the point of no return. But I knew there was no backing out now. My curiosity had already taken me too far. "Yes," I typed, my fingers trembling. The screen flickered, and for a moment I thought the connection had been lost. But then slowly, new text began to appear. "What you are about to see is not for the faint of heart. It will challenge everything you think you know about reality. If you continue, there is no turning back. You will be changed by what you witness. Do you still wish to proceed?" I stared at the screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical force. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop, to close the browser and never return. But something deeper, something almost primal, pushed me forward. "I'm ready," I typed, my heart now pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The screen went black, and for a moment I thought it had crashed. But then, slowly, an image began to form. It wasn't like anything I had seen before. A swirling mass of colors and shapes that defied logic, constantly shifting and changing. It felt alive, almost like it was breathing, pulsing in time with my racing heart. As I stared into the swirling chaos, a deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through my bones. It was as if the very air around me was alive, charged with a strange energy. The hum grew louder, more intense, and with it, the image on the screen became clearer, more defined. Then suddenly, everything snapped into focus. The image was no longer a chaotic swirl, but something that looked like a landscape, an alien world, vast and endless. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, filled with swirling clouds that moved in unnatural patterns. The ground was a jagged, cracked surface, glowing faintly with an eerie greenish light. And in the distance, rising like monoliths, were massive structures, towers or spires, stretching up into the dark sky, their surfaces covered in strange, shifting symbols. But the most unsettling part wasn't the landscape. It was the feeling that washed over me as I stared at the screen. It was as if the image wasn't just a visual, but something deeper, something that reached into my mind, pulling at the edges of my sanity. I felt disoriented, like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that threatened to swallow me whole. Then the text appeared again, overlaying the image. "This is where I come from, a place beyond your understanding, beyond your reality. Do you see now? Do you understand?" I could barely type a response. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "What is this place?" I managed to type, my vision blurring from the strain of staring at the screen. "This is the space between worlds, the place where the old ones dwell, beings older than time itself. They exist in the void, feeding on the energy of the living, shaping reality as they see fit. You are seeing only a fraction of it, a glimpse into the infinite. But now that you have seen it, they have seen you." A chill ran down my spine, cold and unrelenting. I wanted to look away, to close the browser and run, but I was frozen, trapped by the sheer otherworldly horror of what I was witnessing. "What do you mean, they've seen me?" I typed, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "You have touched the void, and now the void has touched you. You are marked human. They will watch you, study you, for as long as you live, and when your time comes, they will claim you." I couldn't breathe. Panic clawed at my chest, my thoughts spiraling out of control. This had to be a joke, a sick prank, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The fear was too real, too visceral. "How do I stop it?" I typed desperately, my vision blurring as tears welled up in my eyes. The response was slow, almost deliberate, as if savoring my fear. "You cannot. Once you have seen, you cannot unsee. The only thing left for you is to accept your fate. But remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand, the less they can control you. Return when you are ready to learn more. Until then, be wary, for they are always watching." With that, the screen went black, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the darkness. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror. I reached out with a trembling hand and shut down the computer, unable to bear the sight of the screen any longer. For a long time, I just sat there, the silence of the room pressing in on me like a suffocating weight. I could still feel the hum, the strange energy that had filled the room during the conversation, vibrating deep within my bones. They were watching me. That thought echoed through my mind, a constant gnawing fear that refused to leave. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound felt amplified, like there were eyes in every corner, watching, waiting. I was marked, and there was no going back. After that last conversation with Emmett, my life started to unravel. The fear that had taken root in my mind grew like a cancer, spreading into every corner of my existence. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of my perception, waiting for the right moment to strike. It started with the small things. Objects in my apartment seemed to shift slightly when I wasn't looking. My keys weren't where I'd left them. A chair was moved just a few inches. The lights flickered even though the bulbs were new. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, a product of my own mind spiraling into anxiety. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more intense it became. One night, I woke up to the sound of soft whispering. It was faint, barely audible, like voices just out of reach. I strained to listen, holding my breath as I tried to make out the words, but they were too distant, too muffled. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding me, filling the room with an eerie, oppressive presence. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, sweat dripping down my back. The whispers stopped the moment I moved, leaving only the deafening silence in their wake. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was hovering over me, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I ended up sitting on the edge of my bed, staring into the darkness, too terrified to even close my eyes. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face the world, not when I felt like I was losing my mind. I spent the day in a daze, trying to keep myself busy, but my thoughts kept circling back to that night, back to Emmett, to the things I had seen, the things I had learned. I could feel the void, the vast, incomprehensible darkness, pressing in on me like a shadow that wouldn't leave. By the time night fell again, I was a wreck. I couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something terrible, something I couldn't even begin to understand. And the worst part was, I knew I was completely alone in this. There was no one I could turn to, no one who would believe me if I tried to explain what was happening. As the darkness outside my window deepened, I found myself drawn back to my computer, to the one place where I might find answers, or at least some semblance of understanding. My hands trembled as I opened the Tor browser, my stomach twisting into knots as I typed in the link. The page loaded slowly, almost as if it was reluctant to reveal itself. When it finally appeared, the text box was there, waiting, as it always was. But this time, something felt different, heavier, more oppressive, like the very air around me was thickening with each passing second. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. My nerves were frayed, my fear too great to dance around the point. "What's happening to me?" I typed, my fingers barely steady enough to hit the right keys. There was a long pause before the response came, as if Emmett was considering how much to reveal. "You are beginning to see," Emmett finally replied. "The more you understand, the more your reality shifts. You are becoming aware of the forces that have always been there, just beyond your perception." "I don't want to see," I typed back, desperation clawing at my insides. "I want this to stop. Please, make it stop." Another pause. This time, it felt like Emmett was almost amused. "Once the veil is lifted, it cannot be lowered again. You sought knowledge, and now you have it. The price of awareness is the loss of ignorance. There is no going back." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had feared this would be the answer, but hearing it confirmed made my blood run cold. I was trapped, caught in a web of my own making, with no way out. "Then what am I supposed to do?" I typed, the words coming out in a frenzy. "I can't live like this. I'm being watched, haunted." "They are studying you," Emmett interrupted, the words appearing slowly, deliberately. "You are a curiosity to them, a new subject to be understood. They do not mean you harm, but their attention is difficult for your kind to bear. The more you resist, the stronger their presence will become. You must learn to accept, to adapt. Only then will you find peace." Peace. The word felt hollow, like a cruel joke. How was I supposed to find peace with this, whatever this was, hanging over me? I wanted to scream, to cry, but I knew it would do no good. There was no escaping this, no hiding from the reality I had uncovered. "Is there anything I can do?" I asked, my hope dwindling with each passing second. "Continue to learn," Emmett replied. "The more you know, the more you will understand how to navigate this new reality. Knowledge is your only weapon now. Arm yourself with it, and you may survive." The screen flickered again, and then, for the first time since this nightmare began, Emmett offered something else. "There is a place, a safe harbor for those like you. A place where you can learn without fear, where the void cannot reach. It is hidden, difficult to find, but I can guide you. Do you wish to go there?" A spark of hope flared in my chest, so unexpected that it almost hurt. A safe place, somewhere I could escape this relentless fear, this suffocating presence. I didn't even hesitate. "Yes, please, show me the way." The response was immediate, the text appearing with an urgency I hadn't seen before. "Prepare yourself. The journey will not be easy, and you will be tested. But if you succeed, you will find sanctuary. Are you ready to begin?" My heart pounded in my chest. I didn't know what this journey entailed, what tests I would face, but I knew I couldn't stay here, couldn't live in this constant state of terror. I had to try, even if it meant facing the unknown head-on. "I'm ready," I typed, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. The screen flickered one last time before a new link appeared. A onion address that I had never seen before. Below it, a single word. Go. With a deep breath, I clicked the link, plunging myself into the unknown once again. The screen went black, and for a moment, I was surrounded by darkness, an abyss that felt all too familiar. But then, slowly, an image began to form, a light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't know what lay ahead, but there was no turning back now. Whatever this journey was, wherever it led, I would face it, because I had no other choice. The screen remained dark for what felt like an eternity. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to expect. I had followed Emit's guidance, clicked the link, and now I was plunging headfirst into something I couldn't even begin to understand. Suddenly, the blackness on the screen gave way to an image. It wasn't like the alien landscapes I'd seen before. This was something else entirely. The screen displayed a corridor, dimly lit by a series of flickering, pale lights. The walls were made of cold metallic panels, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and twist as I stared at them. The corridor stretched on endlessly, disappearing into the darkness at the far end. The text box reappeared with a new message from Emmett. "This is the beginning. The path to the sanctuary is not straightforward. It is a test of your resolve, your sanity. You must proceed carefully, for the void watches your every step. Move too quickly, and you will fall into its grasp. Move too slowly, and you may never reach the end. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I knew Emmett couldn't see me. My hands were shaking as I typed my response. "I understand. What do I do?" The reply was immediate. "Walk forward, stay in the light. Whatever you do, do not look back." I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. Emmett's words seemed simple, but I knew there was more to this than met the eye. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and pressed the arrow key to move forward. The screen flickered as the view began to move down the corridor. The lights above me buzzed softly, casting long shadows on the walls. The symbols seemed to watch me, their shifting forms growing more chaotic with each step I took. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on me from all sides. As I walked, a low hum began to fill the air, growing louder with each step. It was the same hum I had heard before, during my conversations with Emmett, but now it was stronger, more intense. It reverberated through my body, making my teeth chatter and my bones ache. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the light ahead, but the sound was relentless, burrowing into my mind like a parasite. Then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. Footsteps, soft, shuffling, echoing in the darkness behind me. I froze, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. Emmett's warning echoed in my mind. Do not look back, but the sound was so close, so real, that it took every ounce of willpower I had to resist the urge to turn around. The footsteps grew louder, faster, as if whatever was behind me was closing in. My breath caught in my throat, panic clawing at my insides. I forced myself to move forward, step by step, my fingers trembling on the keys. The light above flickered more violently, and the hum grew to a deafening roar, drowning out everything else. "Keep going." Emmett's words appeared on the screen, almost too fast to read. "You are almost there. Do not stop, no matter what you hear." I pushed forward, my heart hammering so hard it felt like it might burst. The footsteps behind me were now a full-on sprint, their rhythm chaotic and unnatural, like multiple sets of feet chasing after me in the dark. The urge to turn around To see what was coming for me was overwhelming, but I knew deep down that if I did, I would be lost forever. The corridor stretched on endlessly, the light ahead seeming further away with every step. The walls began to close in, narrowing until I could barely move forward without brushing against the cold metal surfaces. The symbols were now pulsing, glowing with a sickly green light that made my skin crawl. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw it. A door at the end of the corridor. It was barely visible, a simple unmarked metal door, but it was there, and it was my only hope. I surged forward, driven by a surge of desperation. The footsteps behind me were almost on top of me now, so close I could feel the cold breath of whatever was chasing me on the back of my neck. The door seemed impossibly far away, the distance between us stretching like a nightmare. Almost there, Emmett's message blinked on the screen, barely visible through the haze of fear clouding my vision. Do not look back. Do not falter. The last few steps felt like an eternity. My fingers ached from gripping the keys so tightly, my body trembling with terror. But I didn't stop, didn't look back. I focused on the door, willing myself to reach it, to escape whatever horrors were closing in on me. Finally, with one last desperate push, I reached the door. My hand slammed down on the keyboard, the command to open it sent through trembling fingers. The screen went black for a split second, and then light, blinding pure white light, filled the screen, so bright that it forced me to look away. The footsteps, the hum, the whispers, they all vanished in an instant, leaving only a deafening silence. When I dared to look back at the screen, the image had changed. The corridor was gone, replaced by a vast open space, bathed in a soft, ethereal glow. The walls and ceiling were gone, replaced by a boundless expanse of light, stretching out into infinity. And in the center of it all was a figure, tall and indistinct, its form shifting and flowing like liquid light. "Welcome," the text appeared on the screen, but this time it wasn't in Emmett's usual green. It was white, glowing with the same light that filled the space around me. "You have reached the sanctuary. Here you are safe from the void, from the eyes that watch. Here you can learn, grow, and understand without fear." I stared at the screen, my heart still racing, but the fear that had gripped me for so long was beginning to fade. There was something calming about the light, about the presence that seemed to emanate from the figure. I could feel the tension in my body melting away, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't felt in what felt like years. "What is this place?" I typed, my fingers steady for the first time in days. "This is the space between," the figure replied, the text appearing with a fluid grace. "A refuge for those who have seen beyond the veil, who have touched the void and survived. Here you'll find answers, guidance, and understanding. But know this, your journey is not over. This is merely a resting place, a chance to prepare for what comes next." "What comes next?" I asked, my curiosity still burning, even in this place of calm. "The path ahead is yours to choose," the figure responded. "You can stay here, in the sanctuary, and learn at your own pace. Or you can return to the world you know, armed with the knowledge you have gained. But be warned, if you choose to leave, the void will not forget you. It will always be there, waiting, watching. The choice is yours." I sat there staring at the screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. I could stay here, in this place of safety, or I could return to the world I knew, with all its dangers and uncertainties. But I knew, deep down, that there was only one choice I could make. The knowledge I had gained, the things I had seen, I couldn't just forget them. I couldn't hide away in this sanctuary, safe but isolated from the world. I had to face what was out there, even if it meant walking the razor's edge between reality and the void. With a deep breath, I typed my response. "I'm going back." The figure seemed to pause, as if considering my words. "Very well," it finally replied. "But remember, the void is always watching. Do not forget what you have learned. And when the time comes, when the darkness closes in once more, you know where to find us." The screen flickered, and the light began to fade. The figure dissolved into the glow, becoming one with the infinite expanse. I felt a pull, a gentle tug, and the next thing I knew, I was back in my room, staring at my own reflection in the darkened monitor. The air was still, the hum gone. The fear that had plagued me for so long was still there, but it was muted, manageable. I knew now that I wasn't alone, that there was something out there, watching, waiting. But I also knew that I had the strength to face it, to confront the unknown, and to survive. I closed the browser, shutting off the computer for the last time. The night was quiet. The shadows no longer seemed so threatening. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. The void was out there, and it would always be watching. But I was ready. I had faced the darkness, walked the path, and come out the other side. And whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. My friends ordered a mystery box of the deep web. I now know why alien invasion is appearing in my town. It all started when my two best friends, Kyle and Jake, got this wild idea to order a mystery box off the deep web. We were sitting in Kyle's basement, just chilling after school, when Jake brought it up. You know how he is, always looking for the next thrill, the next crazy thing to do. The deep web had always been a topic of fascination for us, mostly because of all the rumors and horror stories you hear about it. I'm more of a skeptic, but Jake is the kind of guy who would try anything once. And Kyle, well, he's just too curious for his own good. "I found this site," Jake said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "They sell these mystery boxes. You never know what you're going to get. Could be junk, could be something really cool, or maybe something, weird." Kyle was all in the moment he heard weird. As for me, I was hesitant. I had heard enough about the deep web to know that it's not a place you want to mess around with. But then again, I figured it was probably just a bunch of urban legends. Plus, it wasn't like I was actually going to buy anything from there. I was just along for the ride. Jake pulled out his laptop and started navigating through a Tor browser. The screen was dark, and the sites he visited looked sketchy as hell. Even though I wasn't touching the computer, just watching made my skin crawl. After about 10 minutes, Jake found the site he was looking for. A plain black page with white text and a single button that read, "Order now." "Are you sure about this?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my voice probably gave away my nerves. "Relax, man," Jake laughed. "It's all part of the fun. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? We'll just get a box full of garbage." Kyle, on the other hand, was practically vibrating with excitement. "Do it, man. Let's see what we get." With a final mischievous grin, Jake clicked the button and started filling out the form. He used a fake name and address. Smart, considering we didn't want anything linking this back to us. He paid with Bitcoin, and just like that, it was done. We should get it in a couple of days. Jake said, leaning back with a satisfied smile. I can't wait to see what's inside. The next few days passed without much happening. School was the same drag as always, and life in our small town didn't offer much in the way of excitement. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop thinking about that box. I kept wondering what might be inside, even though I tried to push the thought away. The deep web is notorious for a reason, and I had this nagging feeling that we were about to get involved in something way over our heads. Finally, the day came. I was over at Kyle's place when his mom called down to the basement to tell him he had a package. The three of us exchanged glances. This was it. Kyle sprinted up the stairs and came back down, holding a plain cardboard box. It was small, no bigger than a shoebox, and completely unmarked, except for the address label with the fake name Jake had used. The three of us gathered around Kyle's coffee table, and he set the box down in the center. "Let's open it," Kyle said, his voice low with anticipation. Jake grabbed a pocket knife from his backpack and carefully sliced through the tape sealing the box. The sound of the knife cutting through the tape seemed to echo in the small room. My heart was pounding, though I wasn't sure why. It was just a box, right? What could be inside that was so scary? But when Jake lifted the lid, the air in the room seemed to shift. Inside the box was a layer of black tissue paper, neatly folded. Jake hesitated for a moment before pulling it back. Underneath the tissue paper was a small metallic object, an odd-looking, old-fashioned key. It was attached to a piece of yellowed paper with a string. The paper had something written on it in tiny, cramped handwriting, but none of us could read it immediately. "That's not what I expected," Kyle said, breaking the silence. "What is this?" I asked, leaning in closer. Jake picked up the key, turning it over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, made of some dark metal that I couldn't quite identify. The paper dangling from the string was covered in writing that looked like it had been scribbled in a rush, the letters jagged and uneven. Kyle squinted at the paper. "What does it say?" Jake brought it closer to his face, trying to make out the words. "It's hard to read, but I think it says, 'Do not use this key unless you are prepared for the consequences.'" We all stared at each other, the weight of those words hanging heavy in the air. Suddenly, the whole thing felt a lot less like a game. "What do you think it's for?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head, still studying the key. "I have no idea, but I think we're going to find out." And that was just the beginning. If I'd known what was coming, I would have told them to throw that damn key away, burn the box, and forget the whole thing ever happened. But it was too late for that. We were already in too deep. What came next was something none of us could have ever imagined, and it's something I'm not sure we'll ever fully understand. After finding that key, everything changed. I know it sounds cliché, but that's exactly how it felt. We weren't just three bored teenagers anymore. We were suddenly caught up in something way bigger than us, something that made me question whether we were really as invincible as we thought. A few days passed, and we couldn't stop thinking about the key. Kyle and Jake were convinced it was some kind of treasure hunt, or a puzzle, something meant to lead us to some grand discovery. Me? I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I walked home from school, I felt this prickling on the back of my neck, like eyes were boring into me. From the shadows, I'd glance over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there. Just empty streets, trees swaying in the breeze, and that unnerving silence. that only our small town could have. It was a Friday afternoon when things took a turn for the worse. We were back at Carl's place, the key sitting on the coffee table between us, like it was a fourth member of the group. Jake had been trying to figure out what kind of lock it might fit. He'd brought over a few old padlocks from his garage, but the key didn't work on any of them. "I don't get it," Jake muttered, tossing another useless padlock aside. "What's the point of sending us a key if we can't use it?" Kyle was fidgeting with his phone, scrolling through some site that he thought might give us clues. "Maybe it's not meant to open anything," he suggested. "Maybe it's just symbolic." That was when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it, but the feeling of unease had been gnawing at me all day. So I pulled it out of my pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was short, just 3 words. "You found it." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. "Guys," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I just got a text." Jake looked up, curious. "Who from?" "I don't know. Some random number." I handed the phone to Kyle, who read the message and went pale. "How did they get your number?" he asked, looking at me like I had some kind of answer. "I have no idea," I replied, taking the phone back and staring at the message, as if it might suddenly make sense if I looked hard enough. Before I could say anything else, Jake's phone buzzed too. He pulled it out of his pocket and his eyes widened. "Me too," he said, holding up his phone to show us. His message was different. "It's time." Carl's phone went off next. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at the screen. When he finally looked up, he was visibly shaken. "Mine says, prepare yourself." The room felt colder all of a sudden, like someone had opened a window, but all the windows were shut tight. I could see the unease in their eyes, and it mirrored what I was feeling. None of us had any idea who these messages were from or what they meant, but we all knew they had to be connected to the key. "What do we do?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling just a little. Jake, always the bravest, or maybe just the most reckless, took a deep breath. "We need to figure out where this key goes. Someone's trying to tell us something, and we can't just ignore it." The thought of continuing down this path terrified me, but the idea of not knowing what was going on was even worse. So we did the only thing we could think of. We started searching the town. We spent the entire weekend wandering around, checking old abandoned buildings, trying to find anything that might be a match for the key. We didn't find much, just some locked doors and rusty gates, none of which the key fit. The whole time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept seeing shadows moving just out of the corner of my eye, hearing footsteps that didn't belong to any of us. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Sunday night. We decided to call it quits. We were frustrated and exhausted, and the constant sense of unease was starting to get to us. I was on my way home, walking through the empty streets, when I heard it. A faint hum, almost like static, coming from my backpack. I stopped, heart racing, and pulled out the key. It was vibrating slightly, humming with a strange energy that I couldn't explain. The closer I held it to my ear, the clearer the sound became. It wasn't just random noise. It was a voice, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It was soft, almost a whisper, but insistent. I shoved the key back in my bag and hurried home, slamming the door behind me as soon as I got inside. My parents were in the living room, watching TV, and for a moment, I was tempted to tell them everything, but I knew they wouldn't understand. They'd probably just think we were messing around, getting into trouble like we always did. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice whispering to me from the darkness. I didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Whoever or whatever it wanted something from us, and it wasn't going to stop until it got it. The next morning, Kyle called me in a panic. "Dude, you need to get over here, now." His voice was frantic, the kind of tone you only use when something really bad has happened. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed the key and headed over to his place. When I got there, Jake was already waiting, pacing back and forth in the driveway. Kyle came out to meet us, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "You need to see this," he said, leading us into the house. He took us to his room, where his computer was on, the screen filled with lines of code and strange symbols. "This just started happening last night," he explained, his voice shaking. "I don't know what it is, but I didn't do anything to make it happen." I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was just a jumble of characters, random and chaotic. But then, as we watched, the screen started to clear up, the symbols rearranging themselves into something more structured. It was like the computer was decrypting something in real time, revealing a message hidden within the code. Finally, the message was clear. It was short, just like the text we'd received, but somehow even more unsettling. "The door will open tonight." My stomach dropped. This was no longer a game, no longer some weird prank we could laugh off. Whatever was happening, it was real, and it was coming for us. We stared at the screen, all three of us too scared to speak. None of us had any idea what door it was talking about, or what would happen when it opened. But one thing was certain: we were going to find out, and we weren't going to like the answer. After reading that message, none of us knew what to do. Kyle shut off his computer, as if that could somehow stop whatever was coming. We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, the weight of that single sentence hanging over us like a dark cloud. I think we were all waiting for someone else to come up with a plan, but deep down we knew there wasn't one. We were just a bunch of kids who had stumbled into something we didn't understand, and now we were way out of our depth. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "We need to figure out where this door is," he said, though his voice lacked the confidence he usually had. "Do you think it's an actual door?" I asked, trying to make sense of the situation. "I mean, it could be a metaphor or something, right?" Kyle shook his head. "What if it's not? What if it's real and it's somewhere in town? We need to find it before it finds us." That was the moment it hit me. We weren't just dealing with some mystery anymore. Whatever this was, it was aware of us. It was toying with us, leading us somewhere dark, and we were powerless to stop it. We spent the rest of the day driving around town, checking out every abandoned building, every creepy old house that no one had lived in for years. We were looking for anything that seemed out of place, anything that might be the door from the message. But as the sun began to set, we still hadn't found anything, and the sense of dread that had been building inside me all day was reaching a fever pitch. By the time night fell, we were all back at Kyle's place. The house felt different now, colder and more ominous, as if it knew what was coming. We were all on edge, jumping at every little sound, every creak of the floorboards. We huddled together in the basement, the key lying on the table in front of us. It hadn't vibrated or hummed since that night, but just looking at it made my skin crawl. We kept the lights dim, like we were trying to hide from something, even though we didn't know what. Jake was pacing again, his nerves clearly shot. "Maybe it's all just a sick joke," he said, more to himself than to us. "Maybe someone's messing with us, trying to freak us out." Kyle shook his head. "You saw the messages, Jake. You saw what happened on my computer. This isn't a joke." Just as he said that, the lights flickered. It was quick, just a brief moment of darkness, but it was enough to make us all freeze. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice shaky. Kyle glanced up at the ceiling, like he could see through it to whatever was causing the disturbance. "Power surge, maybe, or I don't know." Jake stopped pacing and looked at us, his face pale. "Do you think it's starting?" We didn't have time to answer. At that moment, we heard a noise, a loud, slow creak, like an old door being opened. It echoed through the house, long and drawn out, setting every nerve in my body on edge. We all stood up at once, instinctively moving closer together. "Did you guys hear that?" Kyle whispered, though we all knew the answer. Before anyone could respond, the noise came again, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from upstairs. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his bravado completely gone. Kyle grabbed a flashlight and motioned for us to follow him. My gut screamed at me to stay put, but there was no way I was staying down there alone, so I grabbed the key and shoved it in my pocket. We slowly made our way up the stairs, the creaking sound growing louder with each step. When we reached the top, the house was dead silent. No wind, no traffic outside, nothing. Just that eerie, suffocating quiet that told you something was wrong. We stood there listening, waiting for the next sound, and then we heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deeper in the house. It was slow, methodical, like someone was knocking on a door with deliberate intent. "Where's that coming from?" I whispered, though my voice barely made it past my lips. Kyle shone the flashlight down the hallway, illuminating the darkened corridor. The light flickered as it moved, casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. The tapping sound continued, leading us toward one of the doors at the far end of the hallway, Kyle's parents' room. But it wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from behind it. Kyle's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "There's nothing behind this door except the wall." He slowly turned the knob, and the door creaked open, revealing the dark, empty bedroom beyond. We stepped inside, the tapping sound growing louder. It was definitely coming from the wall behind the bed, a steady, rhythmic knock that made my heart race. Jake grabbed the flashlight from Kyle and walked over to the wall. He pressed his ear against it, listening intently. "There's something back here," he said, backing away and running his hand over the surface. "It feels hollow." My mind raced. How could there be something hollow behind a wall that was supposed to be solid? Before I could think of an answer, Kyle started tapping on the wall himself, moving his hand across it like he was searching for something. Then, without warning, the wall gave way. It wasn't a loud crash, more like a soft, muffled sound, as if the wall had been paper thin all along. A section of it simply crumbled inward, revealing a dark, narrow passageway behind it, hidden in the shadows. We all stared at the opening, a mix of fear and disbelief washing over us. There shouldn't have been anything there. No space, no passageway, nothing. And yet, there it was, a gaping hole in the wall, leading to who knows where. Kyle took a step back, shaking his head. This wasn't here before. I've lived in this house my whole life, and there's no way." His words were cut off by a sudden rush of cold air that blew through the room as if something had been disturbed by the opening of the passage. The tapping had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Jake was the first to move. He took a step toward the passage, peering into the darkness. "We need to see where it leads," he said, his voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. "No way," I blurted out, my heart pounding. "We don't even know what's down there. We should get out of here. Tell someone." "Tell who?" Jake snapped, turning to face me. "Who's gonna believe us? We're the only ones who know about this, and we have to figure it out." Kyle was already grabbing another flashlight, his hands trembling as he handed it to me. "He's right," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. "We started this, so we need to see it through. I didn't want to go in there. I wanted to run, get as far away from that house as possible. But the look in their eyes told me they weren't going to back down, and deep down, I knew they were right. We'd come this far. There was no turning back now. So with every fiber of my being screaming at me to stop, I followed them into the darkness. The passage was narrow and cold, the air thick with dust and the scent of damp earth. Our flashlights barely cut through the blackness, the beams flickering as if the batteries were dying. The further we went, the more the walls seemed to close in around us, pressing down on us, suffocating us. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened up into a small, dimly lit room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, crudely carved into the stone, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. In the center of the room was a door, an old wooden door with iron hinges and a large circular lock. My heart sank as I recognized the shape of the lock. It was identical to the key I had in my pocket. "This is it," Jake whispered, staring at the door with wide eyes. "This is the door." Kyle turned to me, his face pale. "You have the key, right?" I nodded, my hands shaking as I pulled the key from my pocket. The metal felt colder than before, almost like it was draining the warmth from my skin. I stepped forward, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and slowly inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, sliding into place with a soft click. For a moment, nothing happened, and I felt a brief, fleeting sense of relief. Maybe it wouldn't work. Maybe the door would stay closed, and we could leave this nightmare behind. But then the lock turned, and the door swung open with a creak that echoed through the chamber, revealing the darkness beyond. And from that darkness came the sound we'd been dreading, the low, guttural hum of something moving, something alive, something that had been waiting for us. The door had opened, and whatever was behind it was coming for us. The door creaked open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the weak beams of our flashlights. The sound, the low, guttural hum, grew louder, vibrating in the walls, in our bones. We stood frozen at the threshold, unable to look away from the black void that stretched out before us. "Close it," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to close it now." But Kyle and Jake didn't move. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. But there was something else there too. Curiosity, the kind that had gotten us into this mess in the first place. I could see the gears turning in Jake's mind, could feel the pull of whatever was on the other side of that door, tugging at us like a rope wrapped around our chests. Before I could say anything else, the hum shifted, transforming into a deep, resonant drone that made the floor beneath us shudder. From within the darkness, something began to take shape. An outline, hazy at first, then clearer, more defined. It was a figure, tall and angular, with limbs that seemed too long, too sharp, like it had been stretched out of proportion. Its eyes, two burning white-hot pinpoints, fixed on us with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. Jake took a step back, finally breaking the spell, but it was too late. The figure moved, gliding forward with a smooth, unnatural grace, its feet never touching the ground. The air around it crackled with energy, a static charge that raised the hairs on my arms. "Kyle," I hissed, "close the door, now!" But Kyle was rooted to the spot, his hand still on the doorknob, as if the mere act of opening it had bound him to whatever was coming through. The figure was almost at the threshold now, its eyes flicking between us, assessing, calculating. In a sudden burst of panic-fueled adrenaline, I lunged forward and grabbed the door, pulling it shut with all the strength I could muster. But as soon as I touched the wood, the door resisted, as if something on the other side was pushing back, forcing it open. The key, still in the lock, began to twist on its own, turning back the way it had come, undoing the mechanism. "Help me!" I shouted, desperately trying to hold the door shut, but the force behind it was too strong. Kyle snapped out of his trance and grabbed the door with me, adding his weight to mine. Jake, after a moment of hesitation, joined in, his face contorted with fear. We struggled together, fighting against the invisible force that was trying to pry the door open, but it was no use. With a final, bone-chilling groan, the door flew open, throwing us backward. We hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of our lungs as the figure stepped fully into the room. It loomed over us, its presence filling the small space, making the air thick and heavy. For a moment, it just stood there, as if savoring its newfound freedom. Then it turned its head slowly, its burning eyes locking onto each of us in turn. I could feel its gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on me, crushing the breath from my lungs. Carl was the first to move, scrambling to his feet and backing away toward the wall. What is it?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head as if considering his question. Then, in a voice that sounded like the scraping of metal on stone, it spoke. "We are the Harbingers," it said, the words echoing in the room, vibrating through my skull. "We come before the storm, to prepare the way." "What storm?" Jake asked, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one long, spindly arm and pointed at the key still dangling from the lock. "You have opened the door," it said. "The path is clear. The others will follow." I could feel the blood drain from my face. Others? The thought of more of these things coming through that door, invading our world, filled me with a terror I couldn't describe. "No," I gasped, struggling to my feet. "We'll close it. We'll lock it. You can't." The figure's eyes flared brighter, and suddenly, I was on the ground again, my legs buckling as a wave of crushing pressure slammed into me. I could feel it inside my head, pushing, probing, as if it was trying to pry my thoughts apart. "The door cannot be closed," it said, its voice colder now, more menacing. "The key has turned. The invasion has begun." Invasion. The word echoed in my mind, twisting my fear into something even darker, more primal. I glanced at Jake and Kyle, seeing the same realization dawning in their eyes. This wasn't just about us. Whatever we had unleashed was bigger than anything we could comprehend. The figure began to move again, gliding past us towards the passage we had come through. As it did, the air seemed to thicken even more, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. I forced myself to my feet, grabbing Kyle and Jake and pulling them up with me. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Now!" But as we turned to run, the figure's voice stopped us in our tracks. "There is no escape," it said, a cruel, mocking edge to its tone. "You have brought this upon yourselves." I didn't wait to hear more. We bolted down the passageway, the narrow walls seeming to close in on us as we ran. The hum was louder now, reverberating through the stone, shaking the ground beneath our feet. The light from our flashlights flickered wildly, casting long, erratic shadows that danced on the walls like specters. When we finally burst out into Kyle's room, the house was eerily quiet, the only sound our ragged breathing. But something was different. The air was thick, oppressive, and the room felt darker than it should have, even with the lights on. "We need to get out of here," I repeated, panic rising in my chest. "We need to warn someone, anyone, about what's happening." But as we stumbled down the hallway, we realized the house wasn't empty. From the shadows, shapes began to emerge. Tall, thin figures with burning eyes, just like the one we had seen. They moved silently, gliding through the air, their gazes fixed on us. Kyle was the first to scream. He turned and bolted for the front door, Jake and I right behind him. But as we reached the entryway, the door slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking into place with a sound that sent a jolt of terror through me. I grabbed the doorknob, yanking on it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Behind us, the figures were closing in, their eyes glowing brighter, the hum growing louder. I could feel the vibration in my skull, threatening to tear my thoughts apart. "This isn't real," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "It can't be real." But it was. Whatever we had unleashed, it was very real, and it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. With no other option, we ran upstairs, slamming doors behind us as we went. The house felt like a maze, the hallways stretching out longer than they should have, the rooms shifting and changing. The figures were always just a step behind us, their presence making the walls close in, the air harder to breathe. Finally, we reached Kyle's attic, a small, cramped space filled with old boxes and forgotten junk. We barricaded the door with whatever we could find, our hands trembling as we piled furniture against it. For a moment, there was silence. I could hear my own heart pounding in my ears, could feel the sweat dripping down my face. We huddled together in the dark, the weight of what we had done pressing down on us like a physical force. They said the others would follow," Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, my voice trembling, "that we've let something in, and now it's going to spread." Jake was staring at the key, still in my hand, his eyes wide with fear. "We have to stop it. There has to be a way to stop it." But even as he said it, I knew it was too late. We had opened the door, and now the invasion had begun. The harbingers were here, and soon they would bring the storm with them. And when that happened, there would be no escape for any of us. The attic felt like a coffin, the air heavy with dust and fear. We sat there, huddled together in the dark, the only light coming from the small, grimy window at the far end of the room. Outside, the night was still, too still, as if the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We didn't say much after we barricaded ourselves in. There wasn't anything left to say. We were trapped, with nowhere to go, and those things were right outside, waiting. I could feel them, even though they made no sound. Their presence was like a weight pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The key was still in my hand, cold and heavy. I wanted to throw it, to get rid of it, but I couldn't. Somehow, I knew it was connected to everything that was happening, and part of me feared what might happen if I let it go. It was like the key was the one thread holding everything together, and if I dropped it, everything would unravel. Time passed slowly in that attic. Minutes felt like hours, and every creak, every groan of the old house made us jump. I could see the fear in Kyle's and Jake's eyes, mirroring my own. We were all thinking the same thing. How long could we last? How long before the figures broke through the barricade, before they found a way in? And then, just when I thought the silence would drive us mad, we heard it. A low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder. It started as a faint vibration in the floorboards, then grew louder, stronger, until it felt like the whole house was shaking. The figures outside the door began to move again, the hum of their presence rising in pitch, growing sharper, more insistent. "What's happening?" Kyle whispered, his voice trembling. Jake was at the window, peering out into the darkness. His face went pale, and he stepped back, his eyes wide with horror. "You need to see this," he said, his voice hollow. I didn't want to look, but I forced myself to crawl over to the window. When I looked out, I felt my stomach drop. The sky was no longer the deep, dark blue of a normal night. It had turned a sickly, unnatural shade of green, swirling with clouds that seemed to pulse and writhe like they were alive. In the distance, I could see flashes of light, but it wasn't lightning. It was something else, something far more ominous, like the sky itself was tearing apart. And then I saw them, shapes moving through the clouds, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They were the same as the figures we'd seen, but larger, more defined. They were descending from the sky, coming down toward the town, their eyes glowing with the same white-hot intensity. The storm was here. I backed away from the window, my heart racing. "They're everywhere," I whispered. "They're coming." Carl's face was ashen, his hands shaking as he held his head in his hands. "What have we done? What have we brought here?" Jake grabbed the key from my hand, holding it up as if it might offer some kind of answer. "There has to be a way to stop this. There has to be something we can do." But deep down, I knew there wasn't. This was beyond us, beyond anything we could have imagined. The key had unlocked something, and now there was no way to close the door. The harbingers had come to prepare the way, and now their army was descending on our town, ready to bring whatever nightmare lay beyond that storm. Suddenly, the door to the attic shook, the barricade rattling as something heavy slammed against it. We all jumped, scrambling back, but there was nowhere to go. The pounding grew louder, more insistent, and the door started to buckle under the pressure. "This can't be it," Jake muttered, shaking his head. "This can't be how it ends." I wanted to comfort him, to say something that would make everything okay, but the words wouldn't come. All I could think about was the storm outside, the figures descending from the sky, and the feeling of inevitability that had settled over us like a shroud. The door gave one final shudder, then burst open with a deafening crash. The barricade we had so carefully constructed flew apart, scattering debris across the attic. The figures, those tall, angular shapes with burning eyes, poured into the room, filling it with their dark, oppressive oppressive presence. We backed up as far as we could, our backs pressed against the far wall, but it didn't matter. The figures didn't need to touch us to hurt us. Just being in the same room with them was enough to make my head throb, my vision blur. It was like they were tearing us apart from the inside out, unraveling us piece by piece. Kyle let out a choked sob, collapsing to the floor, his hands clutching his head as if he could hold himself together through sheer force of will. Jake was shaking, his knuckles white as he gripped the key, but there was nothing he could do, nothing any of us could do. The lead figure, the one that had first stepped through the door, moved closer, its eyes burning into mine. "The storm is here," it said, its voice low and terrible. "The invasion has begun. You have played your part, and now your world will fall." "No," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. "Please." The figure tilted its head, almost as if it was considering my plea. But there was no mercy in those burning eyes, no understanding. It was beyond us, beyond anything human. It was an agent of something larger, something unstoppable. The storm outside intensified, the sky glowing with an eerie greenish light that seeped through the cracks in the attic walls, casting everything in a sickly glow. The hum from the figures grew louder, filling the room, filling my mind, until I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the key in Jake's hand began to glow. It was faint at first, just a soft, white light, but it grew brighter, more intense, until it was blinding. The figures recoiled, their hum faltering, and for a moment, I felt something lift, just a tiny bit of the pressure in my skull easing. Jake looked down at the key, his eyes wide with shock. "What's happening?" "I don't know," I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the hum. "But don't let go of it. Whatever you do, don't let go." The light from the key grew brighter, filling the room, pushing the figures back. They hissed, their forms flickering like shadows in the wind, and I could feel their grip on us loosening, just slightly. But the storm outside was growing stronger. The figures in the sky were descending faster now, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. And I knew, deep down I knew, that the key was only a temporary reprieve. It might hold them off for a moment, but it wouldn't stop them. Nothing would. The lead figure hissed, its voice dripping with venom. "This changes nothing. The storm will consume you all." And with that, it surged forward, reaching out with one long clawed hand toward the key. Jake stumbled back, the light from the key flaring brighter as the figure's claws made contact. But the force behind it was too strong. Jake's grip faltered, and with a final, desperate scream, he was thrown across the room, the key flying from his hand. As soon as the key left his grasp, the light winked out, plunging us back into darkness. The figures surged forward, their hum rising to a deafening crescendo, and I knew this was it. We had lost. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the storm outside, the sky splitting open, and the figures descending from above. Their eyes burned into my mind, searing the image into my brain, a final terrible reminder of what we had unleashed. And then there was nothing. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, the attic was empty. The figures were gone. The storm outside had calmed, and the house was deathly silent. Kyle and Jake were lying on the floor, unconscious but alive. I could see their chests rising and falling, but there was no sign of the key, no sign of the figures. We had survived, but I knew, deep down I knew, that it wasn't over. The invasion had begun, and the storm would come again. The harbingers had done their job, and now, whatever lay beyond the door was coming, and when it arrived, there would be no escape. We left the house that night, the three of us too shaken to speak, too afraid to look back. We didn't talk about what had happened, didn't tell anyone what we had seen, but we all knew the truth. The door was open, and our world would never be the same again.